And I'm sure you guys know why we're all here today. Bringing in my good buddy Michael Block to talk about a game that he developed entitled We Are Chicago, which details the life of a teenager growing up in a rough part of Chicago and the different instances that he goes through and decisions that he has to make in order to protect himself and his family. But before we get into that, I'm just going to go through, a quick personal story about myself. And then after that, Michael will go through some of the creative process of going through the game. Okay. So we live in a time where witnessing overwhelming amounts of violence is the norm. It seems like we can't look at our Twitter feeds or our Facebook timelines without viewing violent content. Not only does the world appear to be becoming a more violent place, but it also seems as though we have video evidence of nearly every violent event. With so much negativity and violence in the world, it's difficult to not feel anger, sadness, or even fear. Gun violence in particular has been a constant theme in the news circuit as of late. Everything from terrorist attacks to police shootings to random murders to school shootings appear to happen way too frequently. For most people, these are just events that come and go, but to some of us, they hit a little closer to home and really affect us on a personal level. For instance, May 31st, 2015 was a day that changed my life forever. I was coming from a wedding in Cincinnati with my now fiance when I got a call from a family member letting me know that my little brother had just been shot and killed in Chicago. It was a very difficult situation to process. So many thoughts ran through my head. How did this happen? Why did this happen? I don't know what I would have done without the love and support of friends and family members during this difficult time. We were all there for each other in a way that we weren't necessarily prepared to be, but that we had to be. And obviously, at first we went through feelings of overwhelming sadness, but eventually we got to a point where we could talk about my brother's life and remember all the good times and smile. So, different things are going to happen in our lives that will affect us in a negative way, but it's important to, remain positive and keep pushing forward. So, fast forward to May 2016, a year after my brother passed and a month or so after I started at Google. I was speaking with my mother about ways to honor my brother's life when literally the next day I got a new hire email from Google letting me know that I just received a $10 donation voucher. The timing couldn't have been any more perfect. Literally that same day, I donated to the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, which is a group that I've been pretty active in ever since, helping to raise both awareness and money for that group. But really that just led me to realize how fortunate, I am to work at such an amazing company, a company that really promotes diversity and encourages us to volunteer and to donate to different organizations, and will even match our donations on our behalf. Because to most people, Google's a great place because we have cool offices or great technology or free food, but really it's the people that make the biggest difference. And that goes for any company, really. It's each and every one of you guys that make the biggest difference there. So, with that being said, I encourage each and every one of you to be the positive force in the lives of those around you. So, say hi to someone new. Say, how's it going to someone you know. Respond in a timely manner to your friends' text messages, Smile more. Give more high fives, and most importantly, just be a better person, And also I wanted to just recognize, what a unique opportunity, Michael's game is. I feel like we all hear so much about the violence that's going on throughout the world, in Chicago particularly. And, we hear that on the news or in different articles, but this is just a unique way to, present that to the public and sort of raise awareness about it. So with that being said, I do want to kick it off to Michael Block to talk about sort of the creative process and different things that were involved in the creation of this game.
Hi. Thank you for that. And stories like that were the reason that we started working on this project. I'm skipping around a little bit in my slides because this is a little day of, we kind of changed the order of this, but we were doing volunteering, and we heard stories like Antonio's over and over again from people on the South Side about their experiences, and that was the huge motivating factor behind starting this project and trying to talk about things in a more personal light and sharing the kind of personal stories of people who have to deal with these situations and aren't seeking out violence and aren't trying to get involved in things, but get dragged into them anyway. And so that's kind of the focus of the game. So I'm going to get back to my slides. So hi, everyone. I'm Michael. And I've been in game development for about 7 years. And I've been in Chicago for about 10. So I'm not from Chicago. I'm from Wisconsin originally. But I've been here for a while. And I've always lived on the north side of Chicago. And that gave me a particular experience and a particular kind of worldview about the city, and something that this project has kind of changed in my mind about how I see the city now. And I've been the project lead on this game. So kind of a brief overview of what the game is in general. So the entire game is driven through kind of conversation choices. So you're able to make choices. Think of it like a choose-your-own-adventure book, where you're deciding how to respond to things in conversation with characters, and then they, in turn, change the story and kind of respond to you in the appropriate way. So today I'm going to go through kind of our process for developing that game and some of the research that we went through, the pre-production, and the design choices that we had to make throughout the process that were kind of unique to our game. And then I'm going to talk about some of the lessons learned. So we released the game last week. It's been out for 1 week. And so we have some kind of preliminary information about how people are responding to the game and things that have worked and things that maybe haven't worked as well as we had hoped. And so I wanted to kind of share that with you as well. To begin with, our development process. So at the beginning, we were just generally talking about how do we tell a true story in a game. Typically, with games, the player has agency and they can make choices. And if you're making choices about something that actually happened, that can potentially break what actually happened. And so we were trying to wrap our minds around how can we implement a true story in a game and maintain the accuracy of the story without taking away all of the player's choices. And at the same time, we were doing some volunteering, and this particular day was Community Action Day, and basically everybody who was involved fanned out across the city to various public transit stops and other places in neighborhoods on all sides of the city, and we basically interviewed people on the street and asked them what they were experiencing in their neighborhoods, what were the good things, what were the bad things, and in this particular instance, it was how can this nonprofit kind of help your neighborhood and provide opportunities for you. And what we heard, standing at the Red Line stop on 63rd Street, was a lot of similar stories about, people getting mugged or people getting held up at gunpoint, and they could point to this street corner or that alley and talk about their experiences personally that they had experienced or things that their friends had experienced. And we knew that these were kind of commonalities among all their stories, and they were something that wasn't being talked about as much from this personal angle in media and news, in TV. And we thought this was a really important thing to be talking about and something that would fit very well in the context of a game where you're having to interact with things and you're having to make choices and understand a character's intentions and reasoning as opposed to just watching something play out or passing judgment on somebody because they made a choice. You have to actually make the choice. So we were talking to our volunteers that were with us at the 63rd Street stop, and they were super excited about the game, and they were from the South Side, and they were like, we want to help. How can we help? And so we followed up with them and did one-on-one interviews with them and really went in depth about their experiences growing up, talked to them a lot about the specific situations that were very kind of influential in their lives. And then we kind of got referrals to their friends and their friends, and so we got this kind of expanded network of one-on-one interviews that went much more in-depth. And then we started looking for a writer. So during this process, we were kind of reaching out to people to see if we could find a writer who was from the South Side and could really bring their personal experiences and their understanding of growing up in these neighborhoods to the game itself. So we took those interviews, And we were working on these on our own and trying to kind of find the commonalities in them and really figure out what the game was going to talk about. And we were doing outreach to colleges, and I found Tony through Kennedy King College, which is in Englewood, by just reaching out to English professors and saying, hey, we've got a game and we need somebody to work on it. Would anybody be interested? And we got in touch with Tony, and he grew up in Englewood, and he raised a family in Englewood. And he had kind of all of the perspectives that we were talking about in the game. So you're playing as a teenager, but you have parents, and your parents have, a lot of concerns of their own about, what choices you're making and the things that you're doing in your life. And so he kind of had the perspective of growing up in this and also raising a family in this. So he was able to kind of present all of the perspectives that we were looking for in the game. The caveat was that he wanted to do film, and he wasn't particularly familiar with games. And so we were like, okay, we can make this work. This is going to be fine. But there was a lot more kind of learning process than we had originally expected from transitioning from kind of a linear storytelling to branching dialogue and multiple choice options and things like that. So a lot of the early production, you get to see some real early shots here. The early production was a lot of iteration with Tony to kind of hone in on what choices were interesting and what choices were compelling and what things you could give to the player that kept them interested in the story and kept them engaged. And that iteration took a little bit longer than we thought, but it was worth it to make sure that the things that we were representing were being done well and being accurate to the stories that we had heard. It also resulted in us coming to some realizations that we wouldn't have had Tony not come onto the project. And this is a scene from the game. So to set this up, you're sitting down at a table with your family and one of your friends from school, and a gunshot's going to go off outside, and they're going to react in a certain way. So I'll talk about it more after that.
Dinner's ready. Come sit down and let's bless the food. Bow your heads.
Dear Lord, we thank you for the meal we are about to receive, and we thank you for life, family, and friends. Amen.
Was that a gunshot?
Everyone stay seated and don't go near the windows.
I'm so tired of all these shootings. It's like we're prisoners in our own houses.
Lots of bass. So when we were originally approaching this, we wanted to talk about gunshots, obviously. That was kind of the focus of this scene. But our original thought about how this was going to go was that there was a gunshot going off outside, and people were going to be afraid of it, or they were going to get upset and talk about it. And when we were talking to Tony about how this scene was going to play out, he was like, well, that wouldn't happen. People in these neighborhoods have grown accustomed to this to the point where if the gunshot sounds far enough away from your house, you're not going to have a reaction in this explicit way. You'll recognize that it happened, but you're not going to necessarily bring it up and change what you're doing because of it if it seems like it's far enough away. And so that presented a problem for us because making a game, you can get into a situation where the player doesn't realize that something is supposed to play out in a certain way. So if the characters didn't react at all, everyone would basically just assume that we messed up and we made the game wrong, or there's a bug, or something happened and for some reason no one responded, and that would be really strange. So we had to come up with a solution that kind of messaged to the player what was supposed to be a normal event was actually normal to these characters, even though the player was likely not to think that it was a normal event. So we did a lot of iteration with him, and the solution that we kind of came to was having Taylor bring up the issue as a kind of frustration. She wasn't afraid of it, she was just frustrated that it's still happening and that it continues to happen. And that allowed us to kind of get into this discussion and have the wider discussion without making the characters do something that was out of character or seeming to not represent those characters the way that they would react in the real world. So those sorts of realizations we wouldn't have come to had Tony not been on the team, and I think it was super important that we got someone from the neighborhood to work on the writing for the games for this reason, so that they could point out these important things that we needed to talk about, and that we could kind of pass on this realization and this found knowledge to the player, and figure out ways to message that instead of just kind of skipping over it. So this comes down to knowing what to ask, right? And it's all about our assumptions. And we did interviews. We did lots of in-depth things to find out what was happening in these situations. But in a lot of those interviews, the questions that we were asking were based on kind of our assumptions that we had made previously. And so that got us to certain questions, but not to others. And that, I think, is one of the many reasons why having a diverse team creating products is super important, right? Yeah. So another thing that kind of came out of this close iteration with Tony, and also with an artist that we brought on who's from the South Side as well, is subtler things that we were able to place in the environment that have a huge impact on the kind of psychological effects of playing the game, and things that people had talked about when we were interviewing them and doing one-on-one interviews that were psychologically impactful on their lives growing up in these neighborhoods. So in this scene, there's this red X on this house. And for one, the house is boarded up as well, but there's also this red X on the house. And if you've seen that before, or if you haven't, the red X is a sign that says, this building is marked for demolition. And it means that this will be demolished, but it hasn't been yet. So essentially, the building is condemned and ready to be demolished, and it's just sitting there being an eyesore, right? And the psychological impact, as we were talking to Tony and other people, of walking through your neighborhood and seeing a building like this on every block and seeing vacant lots on every block has a psychological impact growing up in those neighborhoods and having to walk past those things all the time. And we wanted to kind of pass that along to the player to give them a sense of what are the impacts that people have growing up in these neighborhoods. So that was one of the things that we included. And then this other one is, another example is this bulletproof glass in a restaurant. So you go to work in a restaurant, which is kind of like a fast food type place. And it has bulletproof glass and an exchange window so that you can get the food to the customer without having to go outside the bulletproof glass. And this, we don't explicitly talk about this. We don't explicitly talk about the red X sign beside a couple like passing comments in some side dialogue. The point was more to just have these things exist in the world and have people be confronted with them and have to think about them, right? And this sort of thing is something that is totally normal. So it would be very strange for the characters to come out and talk about it. But it's something that if you're playing the game and this is not your experience, it's a very odd thing to have in a restaurant. And so it naturally starts to raise questions about why it's there. So another really early shot. I don't know if these are even visible as really early shots. But yeah, so in the beginning, the art was very, very, very scaled back to be really rough. We were trying to get this game done in a year. And we intentionally said, like, okay, we want it to be realistic generally, but we're going to be very, very rough with the visuals because we're a small team and we don't have as much money to fund a bigger project. And as this screenshot shows, when you try to do that with realistic human characters, it looks really strange, and people get really weirded out by your characters. We had a lot of playtests early on where we were like, hey, we just want to know if the story is good. Like, just tell us about the story. We know the characters aren't ready yet. We know that they have work to be done. People would just be like, I can't, the characters, I don't know I can't do anything with this. I'm like, just the story, okay, whatever. So a lot of those design choices that we made early on about being very realistic, they were intentional. We wanted them to be realistic because we wanted the player to have as few excuses for disregarding what was happening in the game as possible. So if they saw a cartoony visual style, they might go, oh, well, this is an approximation, and that's not what everybody experiences, or that's not a thing that's realistic. And we wanted people to have as few of those kind of reasons to be skeptical about the content of the game. So we made these choices intentionally, but they got us into this kind of iterative improvement loop where we needed to keep improving the visuals so that people started to relate to the characters and not be like turned off by the depiction. So the project ballooned to a 4-year project from the original 1-year hope to get the game done in a year, and that caused a lot of extra work, but I think it was worth it in the end. So we took the game to a number of conventions, and this is where we were getting a lot of our feedback. And the first one that we went to was a convention in Indianapolis. And the first group of kids at the booth were from the south side of Chicago. And so this is kind of our trial by fire here, right? We hadn't demoed it publicly before, and here was a group from the south side who would be able to speak to whether it was accurate and representative and fitting with their experience. And the kids immediately got excited, and they started talking about how the house looks like their house and their friends and everybody that they knew, and they were really, 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 really excited about it. And that was super validating and rewarding, and we got a lot of good feedback from them. In subsequent shows, we started demoing in VR because we had this, people keep talking about VR as like an empathy building device, I guess, an experience enhancement. And so we were like, okay, let's try it. Let's see if this is actually effective, if it does actually lead to more engagement and more interest in the subject matter. And we had an interesting experience. The kids that I'm going to be talking about are not the kids pictured. They approached the booth and started making some very insensitive and racist jokes about the characters. There were other people playing on the TVs at the time. And they didn't really have any interest in the game, but they saw the Oculus at the end of the table after they had made their jokes. And they went, oh, an Oculus, I want to play an Oculus. So I was like, okay, well, sure, we'll sit you down and play the Oculus. There wasn't anybody playing, so they played for about 5 minutes, each kid, and they subbed out. And after the first kid played for 5 minutes, he got up and started talking about the characters as if they were people. And he started talking about them in very nuanced ways and talking about the problems that they were having. And he basically pulled a full 180 in the course of about 5 minutes. And there's so many things that are specific to the situation. It's at a conference, he's standing next to the developer. There's lots of reasons why that could happen, but it didn't necessarily feel like it was all, you're standing next to the developer and you don't want to say something bad. It felt like a lot of it did actually come out of a better understanding and an engagement with the subject. So that gave us a little bit of hope that the game was actually going to be effective at what was originally kind of our hope of changing people's minds about people living in these neighborhoods and trying to increase empathy and educate people. And it gave us hope, but it's, again, a conference setting and that sort of thing. So now that we've released, what have we learned? So the game came out last week, and we're going to be doing other things, but here's some preliminary findings. So our goals, primarily, we wanted to create a respectful and realistic depiction of a particular story of growing up on the south side of Chicago. And again, another thing that kind of came out of our development process was this understanding of trying to break down the idea of monolithic representation and really trying to present all these different possible ways that people have responded and did respond when we were talking to them in interviews to various situations. So not everybody responds to a gunshot going off in the same way. Not everybody responds to getting held up the same way. So we wanted to depict that to add to the discussion about monolithic representation. In addition, the point of the game is to start discussions in the players and to get them talking about the things that are happening in the game and their impact on those things. We had these long-term hopes that those discussions would lead to people having these thoughts when they're voting and when they're thinking about politics and when they're thinking about, supporting nonprofit works or things like that. And this stuff is super hard to measure, so we knew that was going to be kind of a long shot, but it was a goal. We were obviously hopeful that it was self-sustaining enough, from the beginning, we knew that this was not something that was likely to make a lot of money, and we were kind of hoping for break even. That was our expectation. Was break even was a best case scenario, and for me, I think one thing that I was really excited about was kind of inspiring other developers to approach these subjects and to hire more diverse teams and to encourage that sort of change in the industry, because I can make a game, and that's great, and it can have an impact, but if I can encourage other people to do this as well, then that should have a bigger impact than I can have by myself. So to me, that was a pretty big goal from the beginning. So the game's been out for a week. Early results are that the people that actually played the game, because there are lots of people that would be happy to tell you what they think about the game but have not played the game, the majority of people who played the game and actually know what they're talking about in relationship to the south side of Chicago think that we did a good job of representing life on the south side. And we've gotten lots of emails and comments and blog posts and tweets and reviews from people who are from the South Side who talked about how it represented their experience, and some critiques for sure, but also a lot of positivity about the representation. And like almost across the board, everyone was saying this is something that needed to be done, and it's a kind of stepping stone towards better things that will come later. So that was very positive and reassuring. We've also got lots of other stuff that was very highly offensive and racist posted to our forums and in comments and all sorts of things. And the scale of it was a little bit more than we were expecting, but we kind of knew from the beginning we were going to be getting some of that. We're just kind of hoping that it would be a little less than, than what we ended up getting. But yeah, so for starting conversations, before we launched, another thing that happened at some of the conventions that we went to, we would be walking around, not at our booth, not near our booth, and we would hear people talking about the game and talking about the characters and talking about what would it be like if this was our experience, if we had grown up in this situation. And I think, in particular, the gaming audience, who oftentimes we'll start giant campaigns about how we have to get politics out of games and we have to stop being so political and all of this other stuff. To know that these conversations were happening at a gaming convention, I think was really a great thing to have happen, and I think it was important, and I think the hopeful shift that we're going to get is that as more people are having these serious discussions in games, that it becomes more normal to be talking about this stuff and to be talking about the real issues that are happening in the games industry around race and representation. And if we can be a part of starting that, I think that's a good thing. From the beginning until now, we've had over 75 articles and interviews, unique articles and interviews across all these different types of medium. Way more than I ever expected when we started. And I think probably looking at our sales, these will most likely have a bigger impact on starting conversations than the actual game will, because of the number of people that are going to be playing the game versus seeing kind of media coverage of it. Although there's lots of YouTube videos that are getting views of like the full game being played. So it's entirely possible that people will get some out of that as well. But yeah, I think this is probably the biggest place that we have been able to actually start conversations. And we've been demoing it at consumer shows and trade events and that sort of thing. So we've gotten some conversations out of that. So for this, I don't know that we can claim anything specific, really. We're only a week out. Hopefully we've had an impact through the conversations that we started, and we're also working with a professor at Northwestern now to do psych studies on the game and talk about the efficacy of the game to educate people and to increase empathy. And those things, I think, are ways that we can find out if we actually have the impact that we're hoping to have, and if we can find out that people are walking away from this with an understanding that then is transformative to their actions later. That's the hope. So, financially, I don't think we're there yet. We definitely haven't recouped the investment that we put into it, and again, that was kind of a long shot anyway. But I think there are two big reasons why, and it was important design decisions that we made very early on that were important to us to tell the story that we wanted to tell. So the first one is this narrative pacing is, as I said, realistic on the slide. You can read that as slow. And generally speaking, gamers are looking for fast things. They're looking for more stuff on screen, more particle effects, more exciting, sound effects, and everything going crazy all the time. And that wasn't the story that we wanted to tell. And it wasn't going to be doing the people that we interviewed any justice by telling the story in that way. And so we made a conscious choice at the beginning to not do this. But it kind of put us at odds with our primary demographic that we were advertising the game to. And so I think that definitely contributed. The other big thing was we take away control from the player a lot. And this was intentional, and it became a little bit more, we did it a lot more as the project went on, in particular because of a game called Spent. So if any of you have heard of the game, basically it's a web game wherein you're given a certain allotment of money, and it's essentially equivalent to a minimum wage job or even a little bit less, and you have to decide how to spend your money. And the idea is to increase empathy with people who are homeless or people who are poor by saying, like, hey, look, this is really hard. If you make these choices, you're going to make bad choices, or you're not going to be able to afford everything, and you're going to have to figure out what you value the most, right? The interesting thing that came out of this was someone did a psych study after the game came out, and they ran it with people who had predispositions against poor people and thought, oh, they're just making bad choices in life, and this is their own fault. And after playing the game, they found that they actually were more inclined to believe that than they were before they had played the game. And the reasoning that the psychologist deduced was that the game was designed in such a way that it presented you with lots of choices. And so if you were playing through the game and you made all these choices and you got to a certain stage and the game said, oh, you lost. You spent all your money. Now you're poor and homeless, right? You went, oh, well, I should have just made this other choice over there. Well, oh well, but somebody would have made that choice, and like, why didn't they make that choice? And you just kind of project this idea of, well, if I had just made these choices, everything would have been fine. Maybe I didn't make the right one in this situation, but there was a right choice, and I should have made it, and they should have as well. And so that kind of tied in this idea of, like, if I have complete control of the situation, and something goes wrong, then I just made a wrong choice, as opposed to sometimes there are things that are outside of my control, and there's nothing I can do about it. And so we did a lot in the game that you have no control over. There is no right answer. There's no choice that gets you out of a situation. You're just in it now, right? And gamers do not like that. They play games. I think a lot of people play games. There's been a lot of kind of studies on this, and people play games because they like having all these options and being able to do what they want and being able to have control of the character. And so when you take that away, they don't like it. It's strange. And so I think the expectation from our side was, hey, we're making these choices intentionally. People are going to figure it out, and they're going to realize why we made these choices, and they're going to be okay with it. And I don't think it's quite worked out that way. And I think those have led to a lot of our lack of financial success with the game. On the industry influence side, we've definitely contributed to the discussion. This was a talk I gave at GDC last year, which is the big game developer conference. And we've had a bunch of people talk to us about their personal experiences and how they're excited to see, more people of color in games and more people of color on development teams, and the work that we've done to try to talk about the game and to spread awareness about these initiatives and that sort of thing. So that's been really rewarding. There was one particular point where there was a developer from Cameroon who was at a convention with us, and they were telling us that they saw our game get coverage in the games press, and that they felt that meant people were actually okay talking about black characters in games, which is simultaneously really depressing that had to be a thing that they were aware of, but then also, very rewarding that we were able to kind of help give them confidence to, talk about their game more with US press and talk about it in that context. So yeah, I think the games industry has had a long history of issues around race and representation, and there are more discussions happening now. I think it still remains to be seen how much people actually follow through on that and not just talk about it. So we'll see how that goes, hopefully sooner rather than later. And going forward, we're working with nonprofit. We have 2 nonprofits that we're partnered with. This one in particular works in high schools to help kids who are at risk for joining gangs or who have already joined. They're basically the last resort before they get suspended from school. And they're trying to convince them, like, hey, we've been down this road before. All the people who are instructors in their program used to be in gangs, and they basically say, like, hey, we've been down this path. Here's how you can get out. Here's how we can help you stay out. And here's how we can get you back in school and get you on a road to success and to thrive and lead a good life. And so we're working with them to try to get the game into schools to help kids be able to talk about these experiences. And we're hoping to expand that. And then again, like I said, we're working with a psychology professor to hopefully figure out how effective the game actually is and what kind of impact it's actually having so that we can speak to that in a more direct way with actual evidence about, here's a rigorous study that shows that this is actually effective. Yeah. So that is the overview. And then we're going to do a Q&A session, I think, now. Yeah? Yeah? Cool. Thanks.
First off, thank you for that, Michael. Really appreciate your insight and going through the process of creating that game.
Yeah.
And as Mike mentioned, we definitely want to take some time to field some questions from you guys. I know I have a couple in mind. I can start it off, but you guys definitely think of some questions that we can sort of get to. So for starters, I guess who was your intended audience for the game? Obviously, I'm sure you're trying to get it out to as many folks as possible, but from the beginning, who was the initial intended audience?
Yeah, so this is something that's changed over the development process. When we started, it was originally, we want to talk to people who are not from the South Side and give them an exposure to this experience and help them kind of engage with this and talk about it in a personal way. As the game went along, we were talking to Tony in particular, kept talking about all of his friends wanting to play the game and getting really excited about playing the game, and working with Reclaim Our Kids to talk about using it in schools for kids who are from the South Side and the West Side. And I think that became an additional market that we were interested in trying to get the game to and trying to develop some additional things for. So we actually did some play tests with some kids from the South and West Side on a couple of occasions, and one of the kids said basically he had been held up a couple of days previously, and seeing it depicted again in the game was kind of traumatic for him. And so we added a mode basically right before launch that allows you to disable the visual elements during violent scenes, and it just puts up text that says what's happening as a way to kind of give people who are in this and have this as a personal experience a little bit of space if they need it to be able to experience the whole game without having to be traumatically reliving experiences that you've potentially recently had.
Got it.
Yeah.
Also, I was just curious about where can we find this game if we wanted to purchase it, and also how much is the game?
Yeah, so the game is up on our website, which is wearechicagogame.com, and it's normally $15. It's 10% off right now. So.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the assumptions that really came to light, when working with this writer that kind of brought in an entirely new perspective when developing the story? And also on that note, can you talk a little bit about why you did choose a game as a medium for this? Because I think this is a big topic of discussion across media in general, but really interested to hear why a game.
Sure. Yeah, so the game thing first, we chose a game because you're interacting, right? Because you have to make choices, you have to rationalize it to yourself, you have to justify those choices in your own mind, and you're playing as a character, so it's not necessarily the same choices that you would make, and we don't present you with an unlimited set of options, so you still have some constraints on how you can respond, but those choices that you're justifying personally to yourself, even in the context of the character, are way more engaging than watching somebody else do it. And it also speaks to the kind of judgments that a lot of people pass, right? If you're watching a documentary about somebody who's living in a low-income neighborhood and you think, oh, they just made bad choices, or if I was in that situation, I would have done something differently. A game basically says, here are your choices, make some choice that you think is better and see how it plays out, right? And so I think from that perspective, if it's done well, again, like spent as the model of, this is not how to do it, right? And to be fair, like we didn't know that wasn't how to do it until they did that and the psych study came out. So it was an important like kind of first step in that. But I think if you do it right and you contextualize it correctly, I think it can be way more impactful than a film. And to the other question about kind of a lot of the stuff came out of just like mindset differences about like how people are perceiving the things that are happening. And I think I'm trying to think of exactly how to say this, but like basically we came into a lot of situations thinking, okay, these are terrifying experiences, or they're very traumatic experiences, or they're extremely exceptional experiences, and to realize and to really put yourself in the position of actually these happen frequently enough that people are not constantly in fear, and they're not constantly upset about them. I mean, like they might be upset about them all the time, but they're not afraid of them all the time, right? Because it's just what you live in now. And I think that was, those sorts of realizations shaped how we were talking about things in the script and what things we wanted to talk about a lot. Okay. Okay.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How does the game end? Like 2 or 3 ways in which the game ends. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So you mean from like a story perspective or from?
Yeah, story perspective.
Okay. Spoiler alerts. Yeah. So. Yeah. Let me see if I can figure out a way to not spoil everything. Yeah, I don't know if I can. So basically, the setup for the story is you're hanging out with your friends a lot, and they stop hanging out with you, and you don't know exactly what's going on. And you find out through the course of the game that they've joined rival gangs, essentially. And so you have to kind of talk to them about, you're trying to convince them that they've made bad choices and that you want to get them out. And they're telling you, hey, I've made these choices for a reason. Like, I don't have any educational opportunities going forward past high school. I don't have any job opportunities because of the situation that I'm in and because of my family. There were a lot of discussions about kind of family influences where, if your father or your brother is involved in a gang, you're assumed to be in that as well, and you're kind of excluded from a lot of opportunities. And so it's a lot about talking about these kinds of reasons that people are choosing to join stuff and make these choices that from the outside seem very odd and like, why would you make that choice? And so in the end, the game kind of concludes with your friends having to reconcile the fact that they're in rival gangs, let me put it that way, and then and you kind of trying to keep everybody safe and mitigate that as much as possible. Is that a good enough answer without spoiling everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was actually just trying to get to just the structure, right? The thought process that people go to and the repercussions, the different choices.
Yeah.
In my mind, there would be 1 or 2 different ways that the game would actually.
Right. And I think, so we made a choice early on. Part of it was from a kind of budget constraint perspective of if we have to make 2 different endings, there's a lot of additional content, and a lot of additional things that we have to create to make that happen. So we didn't want to have a divergent ending, but I think another part of it that came in later was this idea of like, there are some things that you just don't have control over, and your friends making these choices are things you don't have control over. So a lot of that kind of came out of the design decisions early on. Yeah.
I think the entire time you were talking, I was thinking, like, how do we get this into the hands of the #AllLivesMatter crowd?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, how you guys have been thinking about getting the game into the hands of people who will self-select out of wanting to play it, because to me that seems like one of the core important audiences for this, because as you said, with the empathy and the kind of ability to understand what people go through and not be able to hand wave their experiences would be really impactful for this country as a whole.
Right. Totally agree. Yeah, so originally our intention when we started the project was to present this as an interesting narrative experience and to not talk about the fact that it's talking about Southside Chicago and talking about the African American experience in cities in Chicago or in the United States. And the hope was if we pitched it enough as a narrative experience, that we could convince the audience that plays narrative games, which does have some overlap, as we found out at various conventions. There's a fairly big game called Walking Dead, Telltale Walking Dead game, and it's kind of the game that started a lot of the hype about narrative-driven games. And the main character is black. And there's a lot of discussion in the game about kind of the way he's treated because of his race, right? And we literally had multiple people come up to us while we were demoing the game at various conventions that would say like, oh, the game wasn't about a black person, or he wasn't black, or things like that. And you're like, how can you be making these statements? Like, this is a focal point of part of the story is that he's black and he's being treated differently. So yeah, I think it's a huge challenge to try to figure out how to get it in their hands. And I think one thing that we kind of realized was we didn't have a way that we could market the game that would make me feel comfortable marketing it in that way and still get it into that audience, because we didn't want to paint the neighborhood as always terrible, everything terrible all the time, right? We wanted to talk about the positive things that were happening. We have great moments where you're sitting down with your family and like kind of having these familial experiences, and there's a poetry slam where you feel very accomplished for being able to like express yourself and talk about what's happening in your life. And so we wanted to make sure that the game was not all negative all the time. And the way that games generally are marketed to people is high drama, high action, lots of violence, things happening all the time, right? And so to get it to that audience, we had to do things that we weren't comfortable doing, and we never really figured out how to resolve that situation. I do think, really long answer. I do think that the Reclaim Our Kids, getting it into schools, is an interesting avenue to do that. I think a lot of, like, there's been talk about how a lot of trolling and stuff online is like 12-year-olds and stuff, right? And I think if we can get it into schools, not just on the south side of Chicago, but across, the whole Chicago public school district or something to that effect, I think those are ways that we can start impacting, maybe not, the people who are already 20, 30 years old and are, racist and making comments all over the place. But if we can start a little bit younger and reach a wider school audience, I think that could be an avenue that would be effective.
I guess my question is, at the beginning of a lot of video games and even like movies or films,
yeah,
you always see the culmination of why things got this way or how it got that way. I think between either kids that are in the environment or kids that are not in the environment, I think that would be the main question is like, okay, this is happening, this is here, but how did this get, like, why is this like this?
Yeah.
How did this get like this?
Yeah.
What's the story behind it? And I think with that, you get to be, in a sense, educational.
Yeah.
Informative, which is the same thing. And you kind of move closer towards the solution rather than just telling a story.
For sure.
And I want to know if that was in the game or if that was a part, and like how deep you went with that.
Yeah. So our approach, we didn't do kind of the upfront version of that. What we try to do is work it into a lot of the conversations. So when you're sitting at the park and you're talking to your friends, they'll talk about how they can't get a job, or they'll talk about housing discrimination or things like that. And they'll bring up the kind of historical reasons of how we got here with redlining and housing discrimination and highway system, all that kind of stuff. They'll talk about that stuff in the context of the problems that they're having right now. So that was our kind of experiment to see if we could get some of the historical educational information across in a more natural way for the characters to be talking about it. And again, the psych study is going to be very useful to find out if that was actually effective, if people actually got something out of that, or if they were just like, that was a weird conversation, why would you be talking about that? But I think that's the approach that we took, and we're going to see if it was effective. But to us, it was about kind of telling this consistent narrative story throughout the game experience, and not, there's some games that kind of take you out of the experience and say like, and now we're going to play this video, or we're going to play this cinematic, or do something that doesn't seem like it fits with the context of the game. And we wanted to avoid that as much as possible. Like all the menus for the game, everything exists in the world. And the idea was we want you to have this kind of continuous experience of this person's life so that you don't have anything that you think like, oh, well, if I filled in that blank with a better choice, then I could have gotten out of this, right? So that was kind of our thought behind it. And we're trying to get that kind of educational information across.
Gotcha. I think I'm glad to hear that's kind of like baked into it, and that's good. I think a lot of times, even sometimes with my work or anybody else's work, I think what lacks or what helps people, I guess, fully understand something or fully understand what they're getting ready to experience is context.
Right.
And so, you know, while you're talking about the kids that were like making these insensitive jokes or whatever,
right.
Sometimes I feel like if they were to see almost like a trailer of like, okay, like a piece of context, then you can go, oh, okay, maybe now I want to see, you know, what this is about. And that's, I think, what would spur people to kind of jump into it rather than just throwing them in the middle of a, you know.
Yeah.
I haven't played it yet, so I can't say what it is, but it just feels like I need for people to know, okay, people just aren't out here poor or aren't out here disadvantaged because they were like, hey, I want to be the disadvantaged.
Right.
It's been like this systematic things.
Yeah.
So I think that's the link that I think you have in there. I just want to.
Yeah. And I think to that point, we're hoping that the game essentially mirrors our own process of developing the game for the players, where when I got started, I didn't understand a lot of that context. I didn't really know a lot of that detail. But when I heard the stories that people were telling, I was like, this is really strange. Like, why is this happening? Why is this the situation? And that spurred me to find out more and to do more research and to read more about it and think more about it. And so we're hoping that the game kind of gives you this like really high level, here's some stuff that's very interesting that you should be thinking about, and then start those discussions and start kind of a more in-depth research project of sorts into that after the fact, right? So you can play the game and then go, that was interesting, I want to know more about this, and look it up online or find out more stuff. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that. I know we have a couple minutes left, but definitely want to get to the last question over here.
Yeah.
So,
I was wondering what sort of inspiration you took from the current narrative-driven games that are out there right now, like Firewatch and Gone Home, and what lessons you learned about keeping people engaged with the interactive elements of a game.
Yeah. So Gone Home was super inspirational for us. I think the two biggest inspirations were, well, maybe three. There's Gone Home, The Walking Dead, and then there's another game that's not exactly narrative-driven, but it's Cart Life. And Cart Life, the guy that was making Cart Life was basically talking about how he wanted the game mechanics to kind of create in the player the emotions that the character was experiencing. So if the character was experiencing something tedious, the gameplay should be tedious to kind of replicate that experience to the player. And so we did a couple of those things with like setting the table and like stuff at work that's like really boring and monotonous, but it kind of sets up these bigger, more dramatic things that happen afterwards and kind of gives them contrast. And Walking Dead gave us a lot of inspiration for kind of character development and what was a good kind of dynamics to have between the player and the other characters in the story. So we played a lot with that. And then Gone Home was a lot of like kind of filling out environmental storytelling and things like that, which we tried to do. We didn't get as much in as we wanted, but that was a big focus, was trying to tell a lot of things through what's on somebody's desk or what's up on the wall, as opposed to just being very explicit and put it in through voiceover or voice acting. So yeah, there were definitely lots of inspirations to that end. Yeah. Is that
Second half was, what did you learn about keeping people engaged through interactive elements?
Keeping people engaged, yeah. So we have definitely learned that playtesters, both like playtesters that we organized and playtesting at conventions, is not a good representation of what a person at home will play as. We had a lot of stuff that we had been doing throughout development where we were kind of saying like, okay, people are responding well to this, and this is working out well. And then when we get to release and consumer reviews are out, there were a lot of choices that we made that, again, like slower pacing and things to that effect, that did not go over well with like consumer response, but worked fine in our playtests or worked fine on a convention floor when they were playing the game for 20 minutes. So we thought we had learned a bunch of stuff about how we could slow down the pacing, and then when we got it released, we found out that a lot of people didn't respond as well as we thought. So I don't know that we have a good solution for like slower pacing or making the narrative move at a more realistic pace, but I do think it is kind of a process that the industry has to go through where we don't really have an audience that is looking for this in games, and the people who would be interested in this don't think of themselves as gamers. And so I think we're at a stage now where it's just, we're so early on that we need more games like this to come out and to encourage other people to get into games and to be interested in games so that we can kind of grow that audience and make it an actual market that we can target. Thanks.